I will start with a few words of introduction. So first of all, thanks everyone to be with us today. Thanks a lot to the speakers that accepted to join us. Thanks a lot, Mr. Reporter. Thanks a lot also to Professor Ramirez Robles for being, of course, the moderator today, but also the co-organizer and the author of this series of webinar. Through this series of webinar, we are targeting a main topic of the evolution of the WTO and how it will face the global challenges and the rules and the concept of it per regions. We are organizing this in the context of the John A. Jackson Moot Court competition, the 90th edition of it, as an academic program. And one webinar is following each of the regional rounds, let's say, of the competition. This one is following the African regional round. This is why at the end of it, we will announce also the awards of the best teams that won the competition and that have been best orator and best writing submissions. And on this matter, I would like to thank a lot all the panelists, all the teams for their commitment, but also the Universidad de Guadalajara that is co-organizing this series of webinar and which is represented by Edna Ramirez Robles, which is, as I said before, co-organizer and author of this concept. Before leaving her the floor, I would like to introduce her shortly. Miss Ramirez Robles is Professor of International Law, Economic Law, and President of Public Law Academy at Universidad de Guadalajara, Campus Costa. She's Senior Consultant on International Trade and Investment Issues. And in 2021, she's consulting with the WTO on Trade Facilitation Agreement Facility and for the World Bank. She's former legal advisor, officer, at the WTO in the Legal Affairs Division in IDB and in UNCTAD. She's also former editorial assistant of the Professor John A. Jackson at Georgetown Law Center, and the professor from which this competition have been named after. And she also worked at Graduate Institute for Development Studies in Geneva. She has consulted in more than 53 jurisdictions worldwide, including 12 African countries. She's, as I said, the representative of the University de Guadalajara, the moderator, co-organizer of this series of webinar, and author of the concept. And it's my great pleasure to leave her the floor.
Thank you so much, Louis. I very much appreciate your words and the effort that you and your team have done throughout all this competition. Now we are extremely excited to be in the African round and to have these very knowledgeable speakers with us. My gratitude also goes to the authorities of the Universidad de Guadalajara, the Rector General Ricardo Villanueva, Carlos Edan Moreno, Jorge Telles Lopez, Marco González Mora. So all of them have been tremendously supportive for internationalizing this campus of the Universidad de Guadalajara, the Costa in Puerto Vallarta. Last but not least, my deepest appreciation goes to our speakers and rapporteur of this webinar, which is titled Revitalizing the World Trade Organization Rules-Based System, so it can address global challenges with an African perspective. Today, we have an extraordinary group of experts that have dealt directly with international trade issues for their entire careers. It is my sincere honor to introduce our speakers and rapporteur. Judge David Halser holds degrees from Trinity College in Cambridge, the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, and University College in Oxford. He specialized in competition law and other areas of regulatory law, trade law, commercial and constitutional law. He served on a number of WTO panels and was appointed as a member of the WTO appellate body and served as the chairman. As an advocate, he appeared in courts and tribunals in South Africa, Southern Africa, and the UK. He has held appointments on ICC, ICSID, UNCITRAL, and domestic arbitration tribunal. David Halser was a professor of law at the University of Witwatersrand, director of the Mandela Institute, and is a professor of law in the Faculty of Law in the University of Cape Town. In 2018, he was appointed to the High Court as a judge. He has since been appointed an acting appeal court judge of the Competition Appeal Court, and from June 2020 of the Supreme Court of Appeal. Katina Gapa. Dr. Katina Gapa is an international lawyer with more than 15 years of experience in international trade law. She's currently the principal legal advisor of the AFCFTA, Office of the Secretary General. She has built up a formidable knowledge on WTO legal regime and dispute settlement system. From 2002 to 2016, she was one of the pioneer counsel of the Advisory Center on WTO Law, where she represented WTO members as litigants before panels and appellate body. She taught trade law to government officials and provided legal advice to more than 70 developing countries from Africa, Asia, as well as Latin America and the Caribbean. Mr. Hassan Touré is the first secretary of the permanent mission of the Gambia to the UN office, to the WTO, and to other organizations, other international organizations in Geneva. In addition to his national representation roles, he's leading with the LDC group for the fisheries subsidies negotiations. Prior to joining the permanent mission, he served as senior economist in the Ministry of Trade, Industry, Regional Integration, and Employment of the Gambia. He obtained his MBA from the Paris School of Business. Olavisi Akinkunbe is an assistant professor at the Shoreditch School of Law. As a practicing lawyer, Professor Akinkunbe, who we can call him BC, or Professor BC, worked as legal counsel of the first public-private partnership road project in West Africa, where he advised on various aspects of project and finance contracts. He also worked at the law firm in Lagos, Nigeria, practicing corporate and commercial law, and was an active member for the firm's litigation and arbitration practice group. Ms. Colofeo Cougar joined the ACWL as counsel in 2015. She previously worked as research assistant of Professor Marcus Krajewski in the area of international economic law at the University of Nuremberg in Germany, and as a junior associate at WTI Advisors in Geneva, where she provided trade policy advice on trading services and technical assistance to developing countries on WTO matters. She also collaborated with the development agencies on research on regional integration and aid for trade. Our special rapporteur, Neil Joubert, is an international trade and commercial attorney with experience in the field of corporate and commercial law, in international dispute settlement, trade remedies, regional trade agreements, intellectual property, and all commercial legal aspects of international business. Neil is a regular visiting lecturer on international trade law at various universities in the region, having taught on graduate and master's programs, and he used to work at the WTO, at the Legal Affairs Division. Thank you very much to all our speakers and rapporteur for joining us today. Without further preamble, I will proceed to set the scene. The WTO faces significant challenges that have deeply affected its ability to carry out its core function. Its core functions, I mean, the negotiating function, where from 2008, we haven't seen any much progress, but the entering of into force of the trade facilitation agreement that entered into force in 2017, Negotiations on e-commerce expanded, services coverage, investment facilitation and fisheries subsidies are ongoing, but have yet to produce results. The judicial function, members have complained about aspects of the dispute settlement system, including judicial activism, since the earliest days. The United States' refusal to appoint new members to the appellate body, as their terms expired, resulted in rendering it inutile as of end of 2019. In addition to these challenges at the WTO itself, there are global challenges that need the organization must also play a role in addressing. This go from pandemics, starting with the COVID-19, to climate change, threat from new and emerging technology, ecosystem collapse, food security, etc. Although the WTO relies on a highly qualified secretariat, it's a member-driven organization, and this hurdles must be addressed by the members. We have witnessed how difficult it has been to manage COVID-19 pandemic crisis, where on the one hand, we have developed countries who have forbidden or imposed export restrictions to vaccines. And on the other hand, some Latin American countries have opposed to it. Also, the African group leads the negotiations to obtain the waivers to the TRIPS agreement, etc. Regionally, we have witnessed that Africa started operating in 2021, the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AFCFTA, plus the other agreements that Africa has. The newly appointed Director General, Dr. Nosi Okonjo-Iweala, who noted that the organization needs to look for a sense of purpose, that the WTO cannot consider its work in isolation, and for the WTO to make the greatest contribution possible to the progress of sustainable goals, it will need a deep reform to revitalize the rules-based system. And this can be only achieved by cooperation. So we are trying to address all these issues and try to find feasible, flexible, and inclusive reforms for the WTO. In the various webinars, speakers will present their views on how to revitalize the WTO rules-based system, while presenters will be guided aiming to find responses to the following questions. What are the global challenges that have impacted and will impact the most in your region? How can the WTO rules-based system address these challenges? What are the missing elements to strengthen the rules-based system that the WTO would meet these global challenges? Why is the rules-based system in the WTO so critical in order to address these challenges? How can WTO members of your region revitalize the WTO rules-based system? This third global webinar aims to provide food for thought to revitalize the address global challenges with an African perspective. Against this background, I would like to give the floor to Judge David Unterhalter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to share some views with you all. I think we are at a conjunction historically, which is very peculiar for a number of reasons, not least that we are emerging very slowly from a pandemic that has both exposed critical features about the way we govern ourselves, both in terms of its vulnerabilities, but also in terms of its possibilities. And I think one has to situate this entire debate, firstly, by trying to analyze some of the features of the global environment that we now inhabit. And just very briefly, I think I would put it in this way. We once thought we were in a world in which the forces of globalization and international cooperation were almost an inevitable tide of history. We have learnt very hard lessons that that is simply not true. And it is not true for reasons which make our world at the moment both fractured and extremely complicated. So just to give you a few instances of what is so complicated, let me say this. Firstly, we seem to be pretty much on the threshold of a new form of superpower rivalry between the United States and China. And that is threatening to envelop a great deal of the way nation states can interact in the world. That rivalry has both competitive elements in it, it has cooperative elements in it, but how that will go and what trajectory it will take is a huge uncertainty in the world. That's the first thing. The second thing is to at least identify that, surprisingly, the rise of a renewed form of nationalism and populism has elevated the status of the nation state in ways that perhaps towards the end of the last century, we would have thought very unusual and unlikely. But the reassertion of nationality and sovereignty and the importance that that now plays is a major factor that is going to have a big impact upon what kinds of global cooperation can take place. The third thing, though, which I think is equally important, is that there are clearly issues that there is some fairly wide consensus on, cannot be solved either through the assertion of national interests, no matter how big a power a country may constitute, nor can it actually be dealt with on a regional basis and in spheres of power and influence. And obviously, climate change is the obvious candidate, but it just shows you something about how there are public goods that can only be achieved through global cooperation. And I think in a way, the pandemic has also shown us both the upsides and downsides of how crises play themselves out. So quite predictably, we have had both vaccine nationalism, but we have also had the most extraordinary technological development through the speed with which vaccines have come into being. And we have also come to recognize that the interconnectedness of countries, both from a health perspective, but actually equally from a trade perspective, is undoable. These are just absolute facts of life that are never going to be undone. So, for example, in some of the frictions you may have been observing concerning the availability of certain of the vaccines, AstraZeneca, in the UK, EU conflicts that have taken place, I don't know how many component parts are made in different bits. So even post-Brexit, you cannot avoid the interconnectedness of countries, and that plays itself out in so many ways through trade connections where the international division of labor is such and its cost advantages are so overwhelming that the emergent trends of both nationalism and indeed superpower rivalry, though formidable and very important factors in the global mix of things, still leave a great deal of scope for how global cooperation matters and is critical to solving problems which, if properly identified, cannot be solved by other means. So that's my take on the global picture. The second thing is, well, how does the WTO fit into this? Now, we have to accept that the WTO has just been a multilateral institution in decline. And the decline is a well understood twofold problem. One, negotiations simply haven't progressed on a sufficiently broad and important set of topics to give vitality to the organization. And secondly, its dispute settlement system has ground not to a halt, but key features of it through the disestablishment in effect of the appellate body have meant that one of the key utilities in the system is not effective. So we have to recognize that the WTO is in a slowish decline, and some would say that is even speeding up, and it's not going to be solved simply by small incremental changes. There has to be a rather radical rethink as to what its role is and what its role can be. Now, that is partly the fact, this is partly a function of the fact that multilateralism has been in decline as an idea. And that is, I think, responsive to some of the global forces that I've been referencing. So to some degree, and this is not just a pure conceptual or ideological question, one has got to reassert why multinationalism matters, but not as an ideology, but as a practical intervention that matters for the concrete resolution of particular problems. And I think this is where there is a role to rethink things about the WTO and other multilateral organizations, which is with less hubris, with less, in a sense, grand plans for its domination of certain areas, but much more targeted focus on things that matter most, to problems that can only be resolved where common interests can coalesce and people can be brought along. And I think it's that sense of identification of where those areas are and why it is just rational to concentrate on them because there are no other ways of going forward that I think is the key to the future for the WTO. And I think in being a little bit more concrete about this, I think, firstly, there has to be an answer to dispute settlement. It's such a critical part. It remains the place where most members want to go to resolve their disputes, but there are systemic problems which have been identified and where we have seen that if a powerful member becomes disillusioned with the system fails. So we have to be open to what those failings are, and we have to be open to how the system might be revived. Now, you will all have seen many proposals as to what might be done. I think there are, though, some fundamental features which requires acceptance, and they are, I would just say, 3 in number. The first is that a member-driven organization has to, at some point, cede competences to dispute settlement, which they are not always going to like the outcome of. You can't really have a dispute settlement system that is effective, but is entirely member-driven, because that's not a dispute settlement system. And I think conceptually, that is something that people are still kind of grappling with. I think there are opportunities, though, for much greater intervention at certain points for members to come in and assert interests which were not possible before. So one can think about compromises as to how that might be. I myself do not think that arbitration as a model has as many advantages as some people seem to think it has, but I think there are ways of certainly expediting procedures, narrowing issues, being more efficient, and allowing interventions by members at critical points, both in defining the issues and certain of the outcomes, which we should be open to. We shouldn't simply say we had the most marvelous system and it's just spoilers who won't let us reassert that system as part of the WTO. So I do think that's the critical point. The other point just to say about the WTO, and I'm going to be brief, is just this. We all know that the existing covered agreements, important as they are looking very old-fashioned. They don't engage things that are critical to where trade is moving. So we have to revitalize the agreements on services. We have got to engage digital trade and what it means. Investment regulation is such a critical part of the way trade ultimately takes place. We have to revisit that agenda again. And of course, because climate change is going to assume such a central role as in the way countries and members interact, we have to think about how that's going to impact on trade, both positively, but also negatively by way of potential protectionist measures. So there's an incredibly important agenda, and we can't let this agenda simply slip away in ways that it has done in the past. How, of course, to bring everyone along is not clear, but I happen to have a slightly different view from ones that perhaps have prevailed in the past, which is that it used to be thought of on the basis that if only we could take a small step, maybe we will take bigger steps later. And, you know, there was some hope that, well, if you can do trade facilitation, well, maybe you can then start climbing this mountain towards more ambitious things. I don't think it's actually working that way. I think one has got to come back to a big agenda and assert big things about trade that matter, but in a way that tries in a very rational and calculated fashion to try and identify where there are sufficient rational interests of coalescence that everyone can see, at least over time, that you have to have a solution through a multilateral answer, and the WTO is the perfect place to put it. Let me lastly, in my couple of minutes, just say, what about Africa? Well, I mean, the African Free Trade Agreement is obviously itself very ambitious, and I think if it plays itself through, as people hope it will consolidate Africa as a trading region of growing significance. From Africa's perspective, because it has been such a tiny proportion of international trade, we have to recognize the relative weakness of Africa. But there are only two ways of compensating for that weakness. One, by integration in African economies to become more and more important as to international trade. And secondly, through unification in terms of how Africa comes together to assert its interests in the negotiations to come. Both those things are fundamental. And if we can get some of that right, then I think we will have a bigger role to play, even though from a somewhat modest position as matters stand at the moment. Thank you very much for your attention.
On the opposite, thank you very much for these brilliant words. And now I'll give the floor to Katina, the Principal Legal Advisor of the African Continental Free Trade Area, Office of the Secretary General. Thank you very much, Katina.
Thank you so much, Edna. That's such an unwieldy title, and I'm only starting the job on 1 April. So for now, I'm speaking freely, not on behalf of the AFCFTA, but in my own capacity as an observer and an occasional participant in the system. You know, David Unterhalter has just given us really an extraordinary introduction to many of the issues that we are going to discuss here today. And I want to focus on 3 areas, right? The superpower rivalry, multilateralism under threat, and also what Africa can do. So those are going to be sort of like 3 broad areas that I'm going to cover. I agree with David that we are now in this era, we are now on this threshold of a new superpower rivalry after we recovered from the Cold War and we thought we were going to have a multipolar world. But it's looking increasingly like we're going back to that bipolar world, and our area of trade is one of the theaters in which this rivalry is being played out. And it was particularly striking, and thank goodness for this, that we no longer have a President Trump as the President of the United States, because his administration almost single-handedly worked to destroy multilateralism. But David is absolutely right to say that it's not just America, it's not just movements from America that are a threat to multilateralism. Events like Brexit, the rise of nationalism across Europe, all of this is putting pressure on multilateralism. And not only multilateralism, but also expertise, just the whole notion of expertise is also under threat. And it was always very, for all of us in this room, right, it was always very common to assume that the WTO is a public good, but that assumption is increasingly being questioned. And as David says, it's a system that very much seems to be in decline. And I would say that from the African perspective, one of the most disappointing aspects of what's happening in the WTO is the abandonment of what was meant to be a development round. The Doha negotiations started as a Doha development agenda, right? And any of the cumulative effect of gains from early harvest has effectively been diluted by the piecemeal approach in what is now the longest negotiating round. We did not think it could be more, we could have a longer negotiating round than the Uruguay round. And yet here we are. No one seems willing to call time on this thing, but the horse is dead. We are really flogging a dead horse. And I believe that it may be time to just, call this thing for what it is, start afresh if necessary, but we can't continue this pretense that we are part of this, we're still doing the Doha negotiation round when really negotiations have stalled. Now, linked to the stalling of the negotiations, another very disappointing aspect of what's been happening and the attack on multilateralism, the attack on the institution of the WTO, is the abandonment of the appellate body. It sowed such great distrust in what is really the strongest element of the system. And to me, I find it an act of great cynicism. I can't think of a more cynical act. In fact, I'll give you an example of what happened in my part of the world, which is the Southern Africa Development Commission. We had a very powerful tribunal, the SADC Tribunal, which gave rulings against my government, the government of Zimbabwe, on land. And these were rulings rooted in the Constitution of Zimbabwe and in international law. And what did the government of Zimbabwe do? They decided, you know what, we don't like these rulings. So they killed the whole tribunal. They started by, not appointing judges, just as exactly what's happened in the appellate body. You start by not appointing judges, not renewing judges. You then amend the treaty to make it a tribunal that hears disputes only between states, when you never actually bring any state disputes to any tribunal, because the African way is to try and resolve disputes amicably, right? And then you then have an amendment to say, we're going to do away with the tribunal altogether. So I think the end of the SADC Tribunal was a great act of cynicism by the Zimbabwean government, and it's very similar to what's happening in the appellate body. So to me, as an African looking at this thing, it then begs the question, well, why is Africa being told that the rule of law is important when the great powers themselves are not willing to subject themselves to the rule of law, and in fact are willing to go as far as, very cynically, to destroy the instrument that is supposed to strengthen the rule of law in trade law? So I think that's one of the biggest mistakes of the last few years, has been the abandonment of the appellate body because of what it has said about the power of unilateral actions by one member, right? And so I think it's a great shame that the dispute settlement system has been decimated, at least that important element, the appellate body, just at a time when the negotiating arm was paralyzed. So it means effectively there can be no movement. And the General Council itself is very unwilling to do generally, what are called authoritative interpretations. So how is the system going to move forward? We don't really have a strong appellate institution. We're not really negotiating. We don't do authoritative instruments. How are we moving the system forward? And so I think that bringing the appellate body would be a great show of faith in the system. I think that's an urgent priority. It absolutely needs to happen. Revival of negotiations, or at least calling time on the negotiations and starting a new focus with a renewed focus on WTO reform. I think that's very important. And also from the African perspective, this superpower rivalry, if the system is going to be so caught up and obsessed with the titanic fights of its two largest members, then you have to ask yourself, what's in it for Africa? Why should Africa continue to have faith in such a system when, as Edna mentioned in her introductory remarks, issues of food security, that's a matter of very great importance to a number of African countries. That's not being addressed with nearly enough urgency. The vaccine nationalism that we are seeing, the very it would have been a greatly transformative decision that the WTO members could have taken on suspending patent protection just for a small amount of time to allow a greater vaccine rollout. But there, I find there was moral cowardice. They failed to reach an agreement there. So you ask yourself, what then is Africa's role in such a multilateral system when its main concerns are not being taken care of? And I would say, and I'm very glad that David has emphasized just how ambitious the African community is going to be. It suffers from a terrible name. Africa Continental Free Trade Area is a bit of a mouthful, right? So I'm happy to call it the African community because that is essentially what we're building. I think that the African community that we're building is a real opportunity for Africa to integrate as a continent, as David says, to speak with one voice. And I can tell you that it's actually what is on the negotiating table from Accra and Addis is much more ambitious than we're seeing at the WTO. So we have a protocol investment that we're going to negotiate. We have competition policy, we're going to negotiate that. We're focusing on the digital economy, on services, right? And we need to strengthen, the sort of like the defensive elements, trade remedies and so on. So I really would love to see Africa still committed to the WTO because multilateralism matters. But for as long as the WTO is obsessed with this superpower rivalry, I would say Africa needs to look inward and find ways to strengthen itself and its position so that when they come back to the WTO, they have a stronger negotiating position. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Katina. It is exactly time to take decisions. So for everyone, for every country, for the administration in the WTO, but particularly, for these major powers to rethink where are they taking this world and this world trade system. So now I would like to give the floor to our negotiator, Hassan Touré, who's the first secretary at the permanent mission of the Gambia to the United Nations Office, the WTO, and international organizations in Geneva, and he's leading the LDC group, the least developed countries group in the fisheries subsidies negotiations. Thank you very much. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Thank you for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And it's very enriching to hear the perspectives of David and Katina. I struggle with the name, apologies, but it's really fascinating to hear, and the comparison with what happened in Zimbabwe with the tribunal in SADC and what the US did with the appellate body. I didn't know about that, so that was quite a bit of a historical lesson for me. But just maybe briefly, just to touch on the issue of the dispute settlement system. I think the previous speakers have laid bare the issues and what led to the paralysis of the appellate body. So I won't necessarily dwell too much on that, but just to say that I think the restoration of the two-tiered dispute settlement mechanism is critical for the WTO's functioning and also for the ability of members to negotiate new deals, because without a functioning dispute settlement mechanism, there's no means for members to enforce negotiated agreements, and appeals will just go in the void. I think we all know that the United States historically is not a big fan of international courts, but they somehow made an exemption with the WTO. But then, they have had long-standing concerns about the appellate body's functioning, and this spans different U.S. administrations, across the political aisle. So I think it's a common bipartisan position. So, from that perspective, I don't think it will be realistic to expect an immediate fix despite the new US administration. I think we are going to have to wait a little bit longer before we see the restoration of the two-tiered dispute settlement system as we once knew it. And then, from an African perspective, historically, we are not big users of the system, but of course, we have a systemic interest in ensuring its functioning, because otherwise we have a case of world trade sort of just returning to the law of the jungle, where the mighty prevail. And this is, of course, to the detriment of smaller economies such as African countries. So necessarily, I think I'll focus my presentation on two aspects, which I think are of critical importance for Africa and also for the revitalization of the WTO. And I think the previous speakers have touched on it a bit. First, on the WTO's negotiating function, and secondly, the economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. When it comes to the WTO, I think we accept, that, there are faults currently with the system, but also there are some good things that we have to acknowledge. And I think, since its establishment, the WTO has, provided certainty and predictability for the global economy. It has contributed to lifting over 1 billion people out of extreme poverty, many in sub-Saharan Africa. And it also has increased the participation of developing countries in international trade. But I think now, there's a universal acceptance both among WTO members and also, with external stakeholders that the WTO is sort of facing an existential crisis. The system has come under a lot of pressure over the last few years due to many factors, from geopolitical tensions, the US-China trade war, protectionism, and also the proliferation of free trade agreements, amongst major players. So for the system to remain relevant and fit for purpose in the 21st century, I think it needs to be revitalized. And I think we all accept that as the common point of departure. So, we have to start with the negotiating function, because that is what essentially one of the main functions of the WTO is, for members to negotiate multilateral agreements. And as was pointed out at the beginning, since the landmark trade facilitation agreement, which we agreed in Bali in 2013, we haven't had any outcomes multilaterally, even though at that time, we thought that with the TFA, there was this sort of confidence that multilateral deal making was still possible as long as members were willing to show some political will and pragmatism. And then, we followed that up in Nairobi in 2015, which was the first time a ministerial conference was held in Africa. And we agreed on a multilateral outcome to eliminate agricultural export subsidies, which was, of course, an important long-standing goal for many African countries, given the trade distortions these subsidies create. But effectively, since then, we haven't had any negotiated outcome multilaterally. And, the fisheries subsidies negotiations have been ongoing for 20 years now. Under UN SDG 14.6, the WTO was entrusted with a rather simple mandate of eliminating subsidies to IUU fishing and also prohibiting certain forms of subsidies that contribute to overfishing and overcapacity by 2020. Unfortunately, we missed this deadline. And of course, there were factors that contributed to this, the pandemic last year, which affected our ability here in Geneva to negotiate in person, the postponement of the ministerial conference, which was supposed to take place last year in Kazakhstan in June, and then also the early departure from office of our previous Director General, who of course would have had a crucial role to play in assisting the chair to drive the negotiations to a successful outcome. So where are we now? Well, the negotiations are still ongoing, and we are working continuously to conclude by the ministerial conference, which will now take place at the end of this year here in Geneva. The new DG has indicated that the negotiations are a top priority, and she wants members to actually conclude by the middle of the year in advance of the ministerial. So this is a rather ambitious timeline, but one that I think is doable if members are committed and ready to compromise. From the African group perspective, we are very active in the negotiations, given the offensive and defensive interest we have. The African continent is very rich in maritime resources that unfortunately we have not been able to exploit on our own. So what we see is foreign industrial fleets, which are often heavily subsidized, coming in our waters and exploiting our resources, and sometimes illegally, when we don't have the capacity to sort of police our own waters. So this is to the detriment of our population in terms of food security and nutrition. So, from the WTO perspective, if we are able to conclude an ambitious agreement that constrains the big subsidizers, but also allows African countries some policy space to be able to build their industrial fishing capacities and sustainably exploit their resources. I think this will have real tangible benefits for the continent. So I think it's high time for members to conclude these negotiations, not only for the health of our oceans, but also for the credibility of the organization. So I think if we fail this year, the consequences will be really catastrophic for the WTO. Just a final point on the negotiating function. I think the WTO membership now stands at 164 members, and with many others also in the process of acceding. So reaching multilateral outcomes becomes more challenging given the different economic and political interests. So what we have seen since 2017 at the Buenos Aires Ministerial was a proliferation of these joint statement initiatives on e-commerce, on investment facilitation for development, on MSMEs, and also on services domestic regulation. The WTO rules allow members, like-minded members, to get together and discuss issues of interest to them. And these joint statement initiatives remain open to any member that wants to join. But from an African group perspective, some of our members are participating in at least one of the JSIs, but then some have also stayed out completely, for various reasons. So there's necessarily no common group position on how we deal with this. And we know that, broadly speaking, one fundamental issue that WTO members will need to address this year is how the GSIs will sort of be multilateralized. How will their outcomes be sort of incorporated into the WTO's legal architecture? There's an interesting paper that was recently circulated by South Africa and India. So, that's something that's worth reading just to see how the discussions are going on that. The final point I want to make is the economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. I think this is an unprecedented health crisis, a once-in-a-generation type that has had devastating health and economic consequences all over the globe. And the WTO has actually a very important role to play in helping to build a post-COVID economic recovery that is both sustainable and inclusive. Africa, will be disproportionately affected by the pandemic because of our high prevalence of the high prevalence of the informal sector, the global disruptions to key revenue generating services such as tourism and travel. So, when you look at the IMF forecast from I think October, they expect that for Africa, there will be negative growth of -8% in 2020 and 3% in 2021. And the World Bank also forecast that there will be a first recession in sub-Saharan Africa for the first time in 25 years, which will drive up to 40 million people into extreme poverty. So, the WTO has a role to play in helping Africa build back better. And I think the first way WTO can do this is in terms of access to vaccines, which was also raised previously. I think we're all familiar with the India-South Africa proposal calling for a waiver from certain provisions of the TRIPS agreement for the prevention, containment, and treatment of COVID-19. So the proposal essentially aims to waive intellectual property rights so that governments and manufacturers can jointly sort of ramp up vaccine supply and ensure equality. But this proposal, is still under discussion in the WTO TRIPS Council. The developed members, they don't agree that IP has been a barrier to vaccine production. And in their view, waiving patent protections will undermine innovation to fight future diseases and also set a dangerous precedent for sharing technology. So we're still continuing those discussions, but it will be difficult, I think, to have that proposal approved, given how influential the pharma industry is. But we have also seen in recent days some public support from progressive lawmakers, both in the European Parliament and in the US Congress. So maybe that's a silver lining that, there may be some willingness on the part of the big developed countries to engage in the negotiations on this proposal. So just to wrap up, because I know I'm running out of time, just on the CFTA, and I think as already pointed out, this is a potential game changer for Africa if it is effectively implemented. It will boost intra-Africa trade, it will help establishing regional value chains and also building local pharmaceutical production. So the WTO can also assist African countries to improve their capacity to trade, through technical assistance, capacity building, and also through the Aid for Trade initiative, which was launched in 2005. When you see the amount of official development assistance that has been disbursed since then, out of the $451 billion that has been disbursed, 163 billion has gone to the African continent. So this is, I think, quite remarkable, and it shows that the WTO and donor members are willing to support Africa in terms of building its trade capacity. So we just have to leverage on that, especially in light of the pandemic. So, Madam Moderator, to conclude, I think we all agree that the WTO needs to be revitalized. How this will be done, I think it's up to WTO members to decide. It's a member-driven organization. There's new energy here in Geneva now that there's a new DG. She's hit the ground running from the first day. The African group is a big constituency in the WTO, and our voice will be instrumental in shaping the future of the organization. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this inside comments. I've prepared some questions, but you responded to all of them. This joint statement initiatives, I think is going to be key for the members to address, to find solutions on whether they're going to find this legal status within the WTO, and they're going to be able to move forward. Because apparently, from the point of view of other members, such as the European Union, this is the way forward. Like, there are people that call it, or there are members that call it joint statement initiatives, but obviously the European Union and other members call them plurilaterals. So apparently this is the way forward, but you members have to find a way on how you can instrument this legally speaking. And also it's interesting, this statement of Africa and of South Africa and India, where they call it, where they say that they don't have the joint statements initiatives do not have a legal status in the WTO system. And then I posed this question to the ambassador of the EU, and interestingly, he said that this is more than a legal fight, is much more of a political issue. So this can be solved politically. So perhaps we have a window there to start with the negotiations once that you find a solution for that. Thank you so much for touching all of these points. I will come back with just a small question to you after. But now I would like to give the floor to Professor Olavisi, the assistant professor at the Schulich School of Law, and he's the co-editor-in-chief of the African Journal of International Economic Law. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Edna, and thank you so much to everyone who's been involved in the planning of this webinar. Of course, equal thanks to the fellow panelists, and particularly now that David, Katina, and Hassan has spoken ahead of Kolofelo and I. There's a lot of issues that you've covered, and the interesting thing is that these issues are not all so new, which makes one wonder why the difficulty in challenging or addressing them meaningfully. So I think that the way I would like to go is perhaps rather than rediscuss some of those very well laid out challenges, maybe move down a little bit in granular forms and try to look at what it is African states have in terms of challenges in engaging with the global system. because it is the case that once we're thinking about the reform of the WTO, issues of developing and least developing countries, issues really take the back form on the table. And so I think that, to start with, the skepticism that African countries have in engagement with the rules-based regime is a function of many factors. A lot of them are historical, much more are now contemporary, and those specific issues I will get to in a short while. But I think it's important to acknowledge that pre-pandemic, just to go to where Hassan's point was, we faced a lot of challenges, and those challenges remain with us. And the reality is that, they won't only be deepened as a result of this pandemic. We will emerge out of the pandemic with new challenges. And that's what we're seeing with intellectual property, patents, e-commerce, digital services, global value chains, and so on and so forth. So these are great issues on the table that needs to be addressed as part of overall thinking of the challenges that we're facing. On the international scene, though, I think one of the things we have continued to deal with is in the language of externalities, that I call it. I know David referred to it as the rivalries, and the power, super rivalry, as Katina rightly said. I agree with that, except that I don't see China and US as the only actors in that ballpark, right? We can't leave out Russia. We can't leave out the EU, right? We can't leave out other Asian states. Japan is one. I mean, Switzerland has an African strategy now, right? So it's amazing how everybody seems to have their own thing about how they want to relate with this continent. And perhaps what that does is in my view, rather than present a coherent way or strategy of dealing with it, its impact on the continent may be dividing some more, which won't pose well for the continent. I think the second thing I'd like to speak to in the context of global challenges that has made it difficult for African countries to engage with the rules-based regime really relates to the problematic, if you like, relationship of the African states vis-a-vis the architecture of the WTO itself, and particularly has highlighted the dispute settlement regime and how much we just see that as furthering our own developmental aspirations, right? Which is a challenge that there's a void that the WTO has not successfully addressed, which is it's as an avenue beyond negotiating, but meaningfully addressing those economic and sustainable development aspirations. That void remains, and that accounts for a widening gap in how the African states and broader developing countries see their role in the WTO. Of course, one can talk about other kinds of issues in terms of what it means for global value chains and our contribution to that process outside of the raw material producing countries that a lot of African states have been. So I think that's one set of concern in terms of challenges dealing with the external regime. But I think we shouldn't leave it there. I think we have to see that there are regional and national challenges, right, that really makes a coherent African front very difficult. And in this sense, we can think about the fragmented and weak nature of a lot of African states, right? That remains a challenge to the extent that African states as a group have not been able, and I think as David and Katina referred to it, to harness the economic integration regimes that they have. Then we continue to negotiate with the global system from a position of weaker, right, parties. So that's one. I think an often unassociated issue, which is not a WTO problem, but really cripples African states, relates to the new debt issues that we are in, right? Our economies are in trouble as a result of the pandemic. right? And the debt that is emerging from that has a direct and indirect consequence on our ability to trade and to engage on these economic factors. If the outcome is going to be more loan, for example, for African countries, I don't see how we can meaningfully go the trade route to really open up our markets to other aspects that we want to do. I know that's not a WTO issue, but I think in imagining the broader context of how challenges on the African states level really transpose into their interaction with the international level, that's another one. Then we can layer on that the informal economy, which Hassan mentioned, gender issues. But I think lastly, on the first note, relates to infrastructure deficit. It's a challenge. We still have, quite unfortunately, a lot of infrastructure roots that are embedded in the colonial system of exploiting the continent, right? Produce gets out of the exploration area and is on its way out of the continent. It's really not designed to move from Benin Republic to Nigeria, to Niger, to Ghana, and you know, to foster any kind of meaningful integration in that regard. So I think at the regional and national levels, these are some of the challenges. We can think about customs and all of that, but I don't think there's time to address all of that. So that for me, coming out of the pandemic, many of these issues will remain with us. We'll need to deal with them. We'll need to confront the IP issues and the patent and the vaccines. But once that's been addressed one way or the other, where are we? So I think at the forefront of African states' engagement with the global system and the rules-based one in particular will be the need to identify and address meaningfully in the way Katina has spoken about those issues that are at the forefront of the Doha development round, which has just come to agriculture, development, environment, services, right? E-commerce now, digital economy, data governance. All these are critical to our future beyond just addressing economic recovery in the post-COVID-19 era. And so to just quickly move forward then on the points about what else can we think about the missing elements to strengthen the rules-based system. I think, you know, we have to address the structural drivers of inequality. Whichever way we think about them, I think we have to be ambitious. I like to think about them as radical changes. I've argued for this in the context of investment regime that I have written papers on, but that the modest increments should be celebrated, the achievements, to the extent that we exist within a system that we may not be able to fundamentally alter. And I'll say why I say so in concluding remarks. I think we have to appreciate then the value of these levers of push and give here and there. Because as desirable as the radical changes are, at the international level, I think the forces of capitalist structures that control that really makes it challenging to achieve those. I think, you know, the non-inclusive and ill-designed nature of the developmental concerns in the WTO and the flexibilities that exist in there in terms of SDMT all needs to be addressed as well as part of what might help African countries engage with the system despite their own national and regional challenges that I have teased out. And so to just sort of conclude because of time, I think that once we're imagining what African states can do to revitalize the WTO rules-based regime, the AFCFTA really provides something that we can all galvanize around. I know that there are regional economies that, you know, have their own challenges and all of that, but I think lessons can be learned from those to really move the AFCFTA forward in ways in which we can avoid a lot of the errors that we've made at the regional level. I've argued that these organizations do important work. Their courts, their systems. I mean, Katina, I agree with you with the SADC tribunal. But the other ones are trying. EAC is trying, OHADA is trying, ECOWAS is trying. And so we need to appreciate the difficult circumstances within which they are existing. If the WTO failed in its own DSM, then we only have to look at how the African continent has managed, right, to walk through the system without really coming to a crumble at the end of the day. So I think the AFCFTA provides a unique opportunity for African states to renegotiate their reassertion in the global space. That takes a lot. It has to be within the context of a united front, but we have to be very cautious of how much hope we put on legalism. The NIEO in the 70s provide a very interesting experience. We must not think that all we can do really stops and ends at the WTO. I think it starts and really continues to advance from the AFCFTA. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much for these words. It's always now it is time to start looking at the dispute settlement mechanisms at a regional level and how functioning they have been and how functioning they can be for the future in the event that that some of them have functioning features. So now I will give the floor to Ms. Kolofelo Kugler, who's a consul at the Advisory Center on WTO law. Please, Kolo.
Okay. Thank you very much, Edna, and thank you for this kind invitation. As my initial statement, I'd like to say that my comments and statements here are made in my personal capacity and do not represent the organizations with which I'm affiliated. My job is very easy and difficult because I can literally just say I agree with everyone because all the speakers have really raised really good points. So I do, excuse me if I'm a little bit repetitive, but I think some of these issues are very important and worth repeating. And so my intervention, which will be quite brief, will be centered around, I would say, maybe in three elements, I would say. So I will deal with the COVID-19 situation. So right now, the biggest threat in Africa, so COVID-19, and obviously the lack of economic success that has plagued the continent. And some of these issues were obviously brought up by BC. Then I'll go on to the role of the multilateral trading system, the WTO, and the rules. And also then conclude with what Africa can do, or what is the outlook for Africa, what we can do, looking at our role in the WTO and also outside of the WTO, specifically the AFCFTA. So I'm not going to, rehash the numbers that Hassan has said, but from COVID-19, Africa's development trajectory has suffered severely. As we know, before the pandemic, the sub-Saharan Africa was the fastest growing region in the world. And this is not going to be the case going forward. I will highlight just, a couple of stats that were, found by UNCTAD. COVID-19 will drag African economies to fall back to about, back at 1.4% in GDP. And some of the smaller economies will contract up to 7.8% in GDP. And this will be largely because of trade issues, specifically exports, because there's a lot of restriction, there's a lot of movement right now. And also, obviously, the export restrictions that we're seeing, not only because of the pandemic, but not only because of the vaccines, but also because of, the very vital medical products that are needed for COVID as well, and other things. And of course, we also mentioned food insecurity. And so I think that, of course, on top of COVID-19, and COVID-19 has thrown up a lot of issues, but these issues, as BC has mentioned, have been around for many, many years. And there are multiple factors, I think, that have exacerbated Africa's future economic prospects post-COVID. But I think, they come in two ways, internally and externally. And internally, as we all know, and we cannot ignore that, the fact that we have a governance issue in Africa. Corruption is the order of the day in many African countries, if not most, and if not all. And so obviously, if we don't deal with this, we cannot really move forward. And as BC has said, the lack of infrastructure. And this lack of infrastructure is not only in the physical, meaning the roads and the ports and the bridges, and of course, energy, but also, of course, in the lack of regulatory infrastructure, like effective regulations, including some of our regional economic communities rules and some of the overlap. You know, my biggest question is always, I ask, how is the AFCFTA going to work with regional economic communities? What is the advantage of South Africa being in the AFCFTA with, for example, the DRC, when SADC already exists? Is it rather going to be a benefit for South Africa trading with Nigeria because there's no FTA between Nigeria and South Africa? So really some of those things really need to think about how we're going to make it into a success and really sort of implement this free trade area that we've negotiated. And of course, the external factors, and of course, some of these are international rules that prohibit certain actions, for example, subsidies, that prohibit export restrictions. Perhaps African countries might want to beneficiate. Ghana was talking about developing a chocolate industry. How would Switzerland feel if Ghana does not export the cocoa beans to Switzerland? You know, local content requirements, things like that. And of course, as Brice has mentioned, in agriculture, you know, we see still to this day tariff peaks, tariff escalations, and of course, heavy subsidization from, you know, the EU and the US. And so we ask ourselves, okay, we've got all these problems, we've got COVID, and there's, you know, internal and external issues that are affecting Africa's prosperity. How can the WTO, the multilateral rules-based system, really assist us, and what is its role in Africa? And I think it's really important now that WTO members at this juncture start to reimagine and reform the WTO, because simply there is no effective alternative, and especially not for African countries, because African countries cannot engage in the power politics. African countries do not sit on any major table where global economic decisions are made, except at the WTO. Now, of course, there are general things that the WTO can do, and I'll talk about the general before moving into the specific issues that African countries have to engage with and how the multilateral system has to be responsive, I would say, to Africa. Of course, with COVID-19, the WTO has done a very good job at maintaining and requiring transparency. Of course, not all members have notified those import and export restrictions. And this is something that obviously, the WTO can keep on doing, but at least there's some notification, at least there's something that we can see. And also ensuring that those restrictions are temporary. I mean, these restrictions should not be kept forever. They're dealing with the crisis. The crisis hopefully doesn't continue for much longer, or else, unfortunately, there are some issues, of course, and it's going to go on for a long time. But we don't want to see these export restrictions, continuing post-COVID. And also importantly, as many of my colleagues have raised a number of times, ensuring that the current rules to access pharmaceutical products are practicable. Many commentators have written about why do we have to talk about, the issue of a waiver. But of course, we know in the TRIPS agreement that there are compulsory licenses to be used by countries, developing countries, LDCs, whatever country. But these rules are simply not practicable. They are just not operational. They're just not easy to use. And we have the example of Rwanda that, Canada assisted in trying to get some ARVs back in the early 2000s. And it took about 3 years for Rwanda to receive that medication. It's just not acceptable. And sort of generally just, the WTO being responsive to the plight of low-income countries. And as my colleagues have mentioned, this whole, power struggle between China and the US and some of the players, of course, we shouldn't forget the Indias of this world and the Russias of this world, and of course, the Brazil of this world that have left low-income countries really being sort of, left out in the light, and in the dark. And so I think we really need to move out of these developed country issue and really I think those countries really need to start engaging and being honest about how it is they're going to engage. There's certain, aspects of our development that needs to be dealt with, but of course we cannot deny that there are certain countries, especially many African countries, that are LDCs, 33 of them, that deserve the special differential treatment in the WTO. And I think that we can deal with the issues in the WTO in two ways. One is really starting to go back to the drawing table and re-engaging genuinely and really understanding the challenges that especially developing countries face. Members do not understand or listen to each other anymore because there are many more diverse interests on the table. And of course, members have become impatient, as we've seen in the past few years, with the United States really pushing for the concept of development to be reimagined or to be redrawn. And of course, I agree with my colleagues. The absence of the appellate body has been devastating, and I work in dispute settlement at the WTO presently, and we can see the effects. I mean, there has been a chilling effect. Last year, about 5 cases were initiated. This is, far less than what's been the case before in previous years. And right now we have 19 cases before the appellate body. This non-existent appellate body, they're just sitting in limbo. And 9 disputes have been actually appealed into the void. So there's just no appetite anymore for members, especially, the bigger, trading partners that use the system actively. They have no appetite to comply with the rules anymore. And as Hassan has mentioned, this is catastrophic. This is catastrophic, especially for African countries and developing countries, because we cannot play the power politics. For example, this applied to, for example, South Africa. South Africa was subject to the Section 232 US tariffs, steel and aluminum tariffs a few years ago. And, there was no way out of it because we are not immune. Morocco is the only country that has an FTA with the US. The US is negotiating one with Kenya right now. So it means that we don't really have preferential claims and we don't have the political muscle when we get caught in the crossfire between these big countries. And so we really need to think about how we're going to move forward. And I suggest, not really suggestions, but questions as how we're going to deal with the plight that we're in right now. And I think that African countries need to take stock and see what their role is or what the relevance of the WTO is to them. What is working? What is not working? What do we want? What do we not want? Is there actually a chance to get anything from the Doha agenda? And as Katina said, I think we really need to come to the realization that Doha is dead and really start putting issues on the table that one, as David has mentioned, are relevant to today's trading environment, and 2, that also serve our needs and really try and push them and speak, as David has said, with one voice. And there's some questions that I would like to raise up. Unfortunately, I don't have any answers. Do we have room for compromise? What are the issues that are completely off the table that we will not negotiate? And is our current stance in negotiating positions advancing all of Africa's interests? For example, the lack of engagement with joint statement initiatives. Very few African countries are taking part in these. There's just a few of them. For example, Nigeria and Mauritius are taking part in the e-commerce negotiations. But does it make sense for us to boycott these negotiations and then eventually be rule takers? I mean, we see that Africa is left behind. Countries are left, they're dealing with nationalism, as David has said. They're very concerned with their internal issues. Aid budgets are being slashed. And so really, trade is the only opportunity for us to sort of trade our way into success. And as Katina and all of my colleagues said, what do we have now? We have the AFCFTA, but we need to get things moving. Ratification processes have to be completed. Good schedules still have to be submitted. And we have to operationalize the actual agreement and educate the public and the private sector. For example, I'm not even sure that if I cross the border between South Africa and Botswana today, and I submitted my goods and asked for preferences under the AFCFTA, if the SARS or the customs officer at the border will know exactly what I'm talking about. I think we have a very, very big opportunity, but I think that, the key will be implementation. And I really hope we get it right. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for these words. Now we will, indeed, there are so many issues to discuss, and now I will give the floor to the rapporteur, to our special rapporteur, Neil Joubert, who's the director at Trade Law Chambers and also the director at Sheldon Huis, Joubert INC. Please, Neil, you have the floor.
Thank you, Edna. Thank you to all the speakers that have made such really excellent presentations and have raised very important points. As you indicated, I'll just go through the various questions and address the questions themselves and summarize what the main outcome was of the presentation. So the first question is, what are the global challenges that have impacted and will impact the most the African region? And I think it's very clear that the biggest challenge is the ongoing rivalry between superpowers. It's caused a big shift to nationalism and away and it's moved the focus away from issues that are important to African countries. We've heard that existing challenges are still there. They're compounded by the new challenges that the COVID pandemic has brought. The economic impact of the pandemic is an issue of great concern for African countries. But all the existing challenges that were there before the pandemic have also not disappeared. And this focus on rivalry between the superpowers, the shift to nationalism, is a real threat to multilateralism, and especially for smaller African countries. It's a big threat to make sure that issues that are of importance to African countries continue to get the attention and focus that they should get. And the second question, our presenters looked at how the WTO rules-based system can address these challenges. I think it's patently clear that the negotiations have to be revived. There needs to be a stock take of the negotiations and a focus on what are the current issues, not past issues. Multilateralism has to be reasserted, and also the WTO system itself needs to be reformed. Also, we heard that it's important that with the ongoing pandemic, the increase in protectionist measures, we need to continue to monitor those and to ensure the eventual removal of these additional protectionist measures and existing protectionist measures that we have in place. What are the missing elements to strengthen the rules-based system that the WTO would need to tackle global challenges? We've heard from all the speakers that for a rules-based system to work properly, we need a strong dispute settlement system. The system is in a state of, or not in very good state at the moment. We urgently need the appellate body to be re-established and for the rules-based, for the dispute settlement system to be strengthened. So, of course, the reform of the system itself is of utmost importance to keep it relevant for all members, including African countries that to date have not participated at a very high level in dispute settlement. And there needs to be a shift to refocus on current issues of importance to African countries and on the new issues that are very important to African countries. We need to ensure that special and differential treatment remains a main point on the agenda because it is one of the most important points or aspects for African countries. The important question, why is the rules-based system in the WTO critical in order to address these challenges? It's very clear that African countries have no other alternative. They simply cannot resort to power-based politics. There are certain goods that can only be addressed on a global level, on a multilateral level. and especially for smaller African countries, LDCs, individual countries, they cannot make their voice heard individually on their own. It's very important that African countries stand together and make sure that issues of importance to them are addressed at a multilateral level. And finally, how can WTO members in Africa revitalize the WTO rules-based system? I think, to follow on from the previous point, it's very important that African countries speak from one mouth, that they have one agenda. I think it's important for African countries to revisit the agenda and to make sure that issues of importance for African countries are addressed. And the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is a huge opportunity for African countries. Integration can help African countries to play a bigger role in trade internationally and to give Africa a bigger voice on the multilateral level. But it's important that the regionalism is a building block to multilateralism. It doesn't replace African countries' participation in the multilateral system. African countries need to ensure that they also increase their participation in the multilateral system to refocus the agenda of the multilateral system. And that can only be achieved through increased participation by African countries. The focus on, or the fact that African countries are moving ahead with certain issues of importance to them on a regional level will assist them to better participate on a multilateral level. But importantly, it cannot replace, the regional level cannot replace the important multilateral system that is so important to African countries. From my side, that is the summary of all the main points. Thank you, Edna.
Excellent. Thanks to you, Neil. Great to hear you again and hear your comments and wrap up of this session. I would like to open the floor to all the speakers so you can provide comments on each other's presentations. Who wants to start?
I'm happy to start. I'm just delighted to hear so much optimism being expressed by all the speakers on the AFCFTA. In fact, I think I'm looking at our first appellate body right here, because the appellate body was destroyed in the WTO, but we want to bring it back. We want to bring back an appellate court at the AFCFTA. And BC, you were absolutely right to say that there are many regional tribunals that are working well. I simply highlighted the SADC tribunal to show that it's not a purely African issue to destroy a court if you don't like the rulings, right? It's a very cynical thing to do. And so I was just really trying to say that the US did exactly what Zimbabwe did with the SADC tribunal. So to me, it's very hypocritical then for Western countries to then stand up and talk about the rule of law when they are willing to perform the same actions, right, to try and destroy tribunals whose rulings they don't like. That was really the point of that. But you're absolutely right to point out that especially, I mean, the East African community is very impressive, that there's a lot that's going on in these regional arrangements. And to answer Kolo's question, still on this issue, Kolo asked a really brilliant question. You know, we have this proliferation of RTAs in Africa. Where does the AFCFTA fit in that? Well, the principle is that we are building on what is there, right? So SADC is still there, ECOWAS is still there, EAC is still there, COMESA is still there, SACU is still there. But what we want to do is to eventually integrate these in such a way that eventually it all becomes a single market based on the RTAs. And the idea is that those RTAs that are able to move faster, like SACU, which has already a customs union, should continue to move at the integration pace that they want, while we all try to sort of like catch up, right? That's the idea, because it's not possible and it's not fair to say to those who are integrating faster, stop, while the rest of Africa catches up, right? So that's really the idea behind it. But yes, you're absolutely right to say we really need to pay attention to issues like, where does Nigeria fit into a sort of a relationship between SADC and ECOWAS and all that kind of thing. So we really need to look at that. And you're absolutely spot on to say that without implementation, especially looking at submission of goods schedules, what do customs officials know? All of that will just be paper. And this is the one opportunity that I think Africa has to go beyond just a paper agreement, to go beyond solidarity pacts, right? Because I think there's a real urgency. And what I'm finding very interesting is that the optimism seems to be shared globally, right, around this. And in fact, I was exchanging notes with BC to say that there's so much interest in the AfCFTA. The danger might be that it might be hijacked by other or sabotaged by other interests altogether, and then it no longer becomes an African initiative, So I'm really delighted to hear that there's so much optimism about AfCFTA. But Neil, thank you so much for that summing up. It's important to emphasize that multilateralism still matters, the WTO still matters. And we are only saying focus on the AfCFTA because we want, as David says, to give Africa a voice. We want integration to happen on the African continent. I have this weekly Clubhouse session that we do on the AfCFTA, and I always point out how absolutely remarkable it is that Africa is the only continent that doesn't trade with itself. Right? Because you're normally supposed to trade with your neighbors before you start, flying things across, across the seas, right? But our focus has been so much on the preferential trading arrangements under AGOA, everything but arms and so on, because we haven't really been thinking about ourselves as adding value to our raw materials and so on. We've been mainly exporters of raw materials. And what the AfCFTA does, it's a game changer in that it allows us to trade with each other, to trade as neighbors. So that's something that's really, really important. But it's not to say that, as Neil excellently summed up, that multilateralism doesn't matter for Africa, because as he says, there are some issues that are still of particular importance to Africa that can only be resolved globally. And I really liked Kolo's point, which I hadn't really thought about before, that actually, the WTO is just about the only organization that, at least in theory, Africa has an equal voice to the rest of the world. It's not the same at the World Bank. It's not the same at the IMF, but the World Trade Organization, the consensus rule means that Africa at least has some sort of equal voice if that voice is used well. So I know I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much. Those are just my initial remarks.
Okay, okay.
You have the floor.
And then I'll...
Easy.
All right.
Well, yeah, there's a very large measure of consensus amongst us, and I agree with what Katina has just said, which is, that the possibilities of African integration and inter-Africa trade is the route to make Africa a more powerful trading bloc, both in terms of how countries access African markets, but also how what should be the natural economics of trade, which is that you should trade most vigorously with those most geographically proximate. And Africa is an exception to that for reasons largely of colonial trade patterns for the most part. So I do think it's incredibly important that the African community, and I do like Katina's shortening, succeeds and succeeds importantly. I just wanted to emphasize one other thing though, which is just that I think Africa, apart from having distinctive issues which it needs to assert in the WTO and in multilateral forums like the WTO, I do think that Africa has a potentially very important role as an intermediary between these two power blocks that are developing in the world. Partly because, I mean, South Africa is one example of them, but there are many African countries that that replicate this, have incredibly important trading and investment relationships, you know, with both China, Europe, and the US. And that means that Africa's interest is not to make choices between superpower rivalry, but actually to act as a kind of intermediary between them for the purposes of trying to find areas that matter not only to Africa, but can be a forcing house to put things on the agenda and find compromises and actually give recognition to issues where perhaps in this rivalrous relationship, it will become more apparent what are the things that bind members together. And I do think Africa can play that role, but it has to play that role from a position of strength and not as a supplicant for special treatment only. It has to be from the perspective of, we are this hugely important frontier. We're doing some incredibly important things to make this a bigger and more important trading area. We will benefit, so too will our major trading partners, but there are prices to pay, and there are roles for Africa to play, as I say, as an intermediary, a bridge between the superpower rivalry. And I think in that role, we can be incredibly important if we can come together and, as I say, speak with one voice. So that's just one observation to make.
Okay, so I mean, thanks again, Katina and David. A lot of our points overlap, but I like to zero in on two things that I think we need to also pay more attention to on the continent to make possible that position of strength that David has just spoken about. I think we need to look at how we can harness the advantages we have in the informal economy. Now, informal cross-border trading occurs in Africa, and the data on that, I believe, is still evolving. We haven't, studies are still being conducted that really pull together how much is flowing almost like a river in between these various borders that we have, both the known and unknown, right? So the notion in itself that we don't trade with ourselves enough really has to be qualified in the light of the fact that there's so much trading that goes on that we just don't know because they're not the type of trading that has been captured hitherto, right? So I think part of that is to also alter the lens through which we on the continent look at that and bring it into the fold of what uniquely constitutes trading in African context. And bringing it into the fold, I'm not asking for formalization of it. I think that's problematic. I think that's just going to exclude so many people that act in that industry and push them further away into illicit trading activities. The second point, which has two dimensions, is that I love the role of the courts that you mentioned. And I cannot but bring up this book, which I contributed to, which, copy just arrived last week. So it's still fresh on my table. But scholarship is evolving. That is documenting regional economic integration in Africa on our own terms. You see, we don't need people writing this. We appreciate that everybody wants to write on it, Katina, but we need to write it from our own lens through and how we see it from the ground up, right? So I think more of that kind of knowledge contribution to pluralizing the legal orderings in the multilateral scheme is important as we move forward gradually. But I won't say this alone, but one of the persons in the audience who I didn't know was here sent me a message and said, what about actors? And I've asked him to please, ask the question, but So to just give him credit, which was also part of my thought, so not to say me alone, he's asked, we need to think about the various actors as well and not be so state-centric, even though in the international legal order, they are the primary actors. But there are so many other actors, private sector, involvement in the AfCFTA is critical, but I'll yield given how much time we have left. Thank you very much.
This is exactly why we're here. We're different actors that know the system and that want to bring a small contribution to this reform, right? So indeed, it is critical, and these other stakeholders play a critical role and have played a critical role in the move forward of the UN, for example. But we haven't seen that much this at the WTO. So I think it's also something that we need to keep working on this. Is there, sorry for interrupting, perhaps Kolofelo wanted to say something?
Yes, I have very, very sort of, 3 points that I wanted to make. And I think this goes to the comment that I made earlier about, Ghana, imagining itself as a chocolate, hub, which I think is possible. And, I saw the speech that the Ghanaian president made, when he visited Switzerland, and it was actually quite interesting to watch, the reaction from both sides. But one thing that is in the AfCFTA, agreement is the point of regional value chains. I think once we really harness Africa's potential economically and really try to start developing and manufacturing goods on our own continent, this is when we're going to change the game. As everybody has said, gone, it has to be gone is the time when we are exporting Brent crude to import it at triple the price or 10 times the price. It just doesn't make sense. And I'm really excited about this. I'm really excited about using, continental capacities and knowledge, there's pharma industries in South Africa. How do we make sure that we grow and we develop that, industry so that we're not in the same position that we're right now? We are begging for developed countries to send us vaccines. There's a lot of capacity on the continent. I mean, there's tons of us sitting in this call right now who are from the continent. There's no lack of brain matter. We're very intelligent people, but I think we just really need to harness that. And I think this, agreement really has the potential for, to change the game, the economic game of the entire world, really. Secondly is, I think one thing that we haven't mentioned, or if it's mentioned, was really in passing, the issue of trust. I think we should not underestimate that. I know my country, I'm from South Africa, and this freedom of movement issue is something that is really, really sensitive and contentious. And we really need to deal with that. If we're really going to have a continent-wide agreement that talks about, opening investment, opening trade, we also need to talk about how do we deal with movement of people, and these are issues that, we can try all we do as much as we can, but if we can't trust each other and trust our systems and build systems that are trustable, how are we going to make this work? For example, trading on the African continent, some currencies cannot be exchanged into others. So we default into, trading with dollars. I mean, how's that gonna work? Are we gonna have an afro? What's happening? And so we really, I think, need to start with the basic things and really start building up to make sure that we don't double guess ourselves and we don't trip ourselves up. Because this regional integration project, although we've had successes, and as was mentioned, the East African community has been, one of the leaders of what can happen with trade integration in Africa. But we really need to make sure that we really tweak the nitty-gritty aspects of everything to make sure that we're successful. Finally, I'm going to close with dispute settlement. I don't know about, African countries resolving disputes diplomatically. I can see, and I see where you come from, Katina, but I can also see the instance where, companies are just tired because they just don't get the support that they need. And, to the extent, if we keep dispute settlement at a state-to-state level, I think this is never going to go forward. We're just never going to see the type of resolution that's needed. We're never going to see the type of engagement from the private sector that's needed. And so maybe we need to reimagine and really use those provisions in the dispute settlement protocol that calls for, amicable resolution of disputes, and really not focus so hard on something that looks like a WTO trade court. So that's it.
Yeah, and learning from the past, right? From this experience in the WTO will be useful. Last but not least, Mr. Touré, do you have anything that you would like to mention?
Not much to add. I think previous speakers have summed up the discussion well. There was one interesting point that Judge David raised about sort of how do we go forward on the negotiating track? And I think if I'm right, he sort of mentioned that this piecemeal approach where we sort of deal with specific issues at a given time may not necessarily be the sort of the best way to go, and we sort of need a broader, not perhaps reverting back to the sort of Doha round, but sort of having a broad multilateral agenda. But I wonder, whether that might not be another recipe for disaster, given what transpired before, and we should just necessarily perhaps focus on key areas that has potential for deliverables, especially in the short to medium term, and then take it from there. But I just have a feeling that if we try to overload the agenda, especially for this ministerial conference, given how little time we have left, it's going to be another repeat of what happened at Buenos Aires. But food for thought, I think. Thanks.
Yes, indeed. And Katina, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I just want just to point something out. So, Kolo, your currency issue has been resolved. Afrexim Bank has set up a multi-currency payment system. So we're not going to be trading on the US dollar. We're going to be trading in local currency through this multi-currency system. But I want to hear from Hassan Touré, because I haven't really been catching up with developments at the WTO. What do you think are the prospects of success at this new ministerial? I know you said that having Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala coming on board has kind of like re-energized the system, and she really is a ball of energy, isn't she? But I'm just wondering, what's your assessment of where you think the WTO members are? Do you think that there's scope for some kind of like goodwill, basic, especially on fisheries, or what do you think are the prospects of any kind of success?
Tough question.
Well, you're in Geneva, we're not.
Well, there's a lot of goodwill right now, but goodwill doesn't necessarily translate to compromise in the room, and we're seeing that right now in the ongoing fisheries negotiations. And I think this is really the only potential multilateral outcome we're going to have at MC12. I think on agriculture, there's just too little time left. Perhaps we can agree on the modalities for a future work program post MC12, but certainly for this ministerial, given how little time we have left, and also the fact that we don't necessarily know what type of ministerial we're going to have. Is it going to be a hybrid ministerial? Are ministers going to be able to come to Geneva? Will it be a virtual ministerial conference for the first time? We've seen UNCTAD just recently announced that UNCTAD 15 in Barbados is going to be virtual. So, there's a lot of circumstances that are going to dictate how the ministerial proceeds. But certainly, from a multilateral perspective, fish is the only one that I think is doable. For the JSIs, I think when you hear from many of the proponents, they don't expect any outcomes at this one, maybe except on services domestic regulation, but on the joint statement initiative on investment facilitation and even on e-commerce. I think the proponents are clear that there'll need to be future work done after MC12. So just on the multilateral track, fish is the only one, and if we don't succeed, well, it might be lights out for the WTO, but let's see.
Thank you very much to everyone. Now we will proceed with the questions and answers stage. And we have one question from Joanna Ivanova to Judge Walter Halser. She's asking, we heard some comments from the former U.S. administration questioning the need to preserve the second instance, i.e. the appellate body. What is your view in this regard? You're muted, Judge.
Sorry, I think it's incredibly important to maintain a two-tier system. I mean, one can think about what are the issues that should go on appeal or compulsorily can go on appeal. And there may be some scope for narrowing those and narrowing to some degree the jurisdiction on appeal. That I think is negotiable. Why do I say that a two-tier system is so important? I mean, the kinds of issues that come to the WTO are almost always by definition of huge importance to the members involved. And, you know, error is just a natural feature of all adjudication. So why do most domestic systems permit of appeal? Because we recognize error. So I think that, you know, an appellate system, particularly if the appellate body, as has been the case, is a standing body that does try to think about predictability over the system as a whole, is ultimately something that has huge value. Of course, there is another way of conceptualizing the whole dispute settlement system, which is treat it as a form of one-off arbitration, where nothing of systemic importance is decided that has ongoing consequences for the membership as a whole by way of authoritative interpretation. Now, you can have that system, but it is a system of, to my mind, much less utility. So I think it's an important question, but it's bound up with a lot of the systemically valuable features of the dispute settlement system, which I don't think should be lost, and I think would be lost if you simply had, in effect, once-off ad hoc arbitrations.
Edna, may I just follow up on that and just push Justice Unterhalter a little bit and say, well, wouldn't you agree, though, that the US does have a point, especially on this issue, if we agree that the second kick at the can, the two-tier system is important? The way that the appellate body has completed the analysis in some cases, effectively fact-finding, right? And then making rulings on the basis of those so-called uncontested facts, which may actually not be uncontested facts. Couldn't it be argued that in those instances, the appellate body effectively failed the members by not giving them that second kick at the can, by not giving them that the opportunity for that review, by doing the work that a panel should have done?
I mean, I think, you know, there's some merit in the criticism that is made, but remember that the completion of the analysis and the way it grew was effectively a function of the fact that the appellate body didn't have the power to send a matter back to the panel to do the work that should be done there. So I agree entirely. Fact-finding should be done by the panel. I happen to have always been a supporter of a more established form of panel decision with, you know, where the power relationship, particularly between the Secretariat and the panels, was redressed to some degree. So a more considered, more permanently established panel system, possibly with people who are brought in from time to time with specialized expertise. I think I came up through the panel system. I think it had strengths and weaknesses. I think it should be strengthened. And so I personally favor a situation where fewer kinds of issues can be determined by the appellate body, but there's more flexibility to make sure that you get good fact-finding at the panel stage, and if necessary, because certain facts become important potentially to resolve a dispute, send it back, have the power to do so.
We shall certainly apply those lessons in the African.
I have no doubt.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's great to have this type of exchanges, because otherwise then we stay only with one voice and one point of view, and then it is extremely enrichful. I had the pleasure of working at the Legal Affairs Division, and indeed I think it's dealing with evidence is one of the most difficult things I've ever done in my life, and trying to find an own story is just very difficult with such a talented lawyers that we have on both sides. So I think indeed, like, there's room for improvement on both instances, but it is a matter of talking and cooperating and then finding new solutions. So I very much appreciate these responses. I do have one more question that for Mr. Hassan Touré. The TFA, the Trade Facilitation Agreement Section 2, that is the one that deals with S&D with special and differential treatment, has been considered as successful. It's innovative. It has two important features. One, the self-designation of the level of compliance of the developing countries and LDCs. And then also that when these members also consider that they don't comply with certain obligations, they are allowed also to ask for technical assistance. So is this approach followed by any of the current negotiations, for example, the fisheries negotiations, or is there any innovative feature or something that you can talk about the S&D features that are happening in the negotiations at the moment?
Good question. When it comes to special and differential treatment, it's usually a topic that's very divisive when it's being discussed, because you basically have members with different viewpoints. On the one hand, you have those who rightly say that this is a treaty embedded right, it has to be applied to all agreements. And then on the other hand, you have other members who have said that certain more advanced developing members have sort of graduated out of self-declared developing country status, and they should be willing to take on commitments commensurate with their level of development. So, the TFA approach, it was innovative in a sense, but I don't know if it can be replicated in all agreements, because, TFA dealt with trade facilitation. It was in the interest of countries in terms of reducing trade costs and really helping your economy grow. But I don't know whether that same formula can be replicated in other agreements. I don't think you can replicate it in fish, for example. So, I think just on the broader sense, when it comes to S&D, we need to have a frank discussion amongst members as to how this will apply. But I don't think, starting from a departure point where you tell members that they have to give up S&D, it's conducive for the discussion, because then, the members don't engage, because this is a treaty embedded right. They're not going to give it up. So I think there has to be some sort of level of trust where developed members accept that those developing members who necessarily have the capacity to implement agreements from the get-go will opt out if they think it's to their benefit. If they think that they can do so, they have the capacity. And we have seen right now some countries have opted out of developing country status, but this should be the individual right of members. It should not be imposed on countries. So I think it's a divisive topic. It's difficult. It affects how we engage in the negotiations, because the positions are just far apart. And of course, we know the history when it comes to paragraph 44 and implementing existing S&D provisions in terms of making them more precise and operational. That discussion is still ongoing in the CTDSS. the Committee on Trade and Development in special session. So, you know, I think members will just need to re-examine how we approach S&D going forward. Thanks.
I just want to say something, not directly to that question, but more broadly that, I mean, it's just a resource and I'll now share it, that on Afronomics Law, which I co-edit with James Gathi and some, and TT and Ohio, there was a recent symposium on trade facilitation. And I think the people who've written this are some of, in my opinion, core thinkers on this issue. And Africans who study the issue. So it may be of interest to some of our audience to just look at them as well. But that's just something around resource than less speaking to the question. Thanks.
Thank you, and thanks for sharing in the chat this symposium. We will definitely take a look. Now I will proceed with concluding remarks. But before doing that, I would like to thank everyone. Neil, thank you so much for this wonderful wrap up. Everyone has congratulated you in the chat, and thank you everyone. We are short on time, but I'm going to make just like a few concluding remarks. I think it's important, or we can conclude that we are at the stage that we need to select what is relevant and what are these challenges. That as soon as this discussion between plurilaterals and joint statements initiatives find or conciliate, then there can be a way forward to continue with the negotiations. That there's no doubt that the dispute settlement mechanism needs to be relaunched, and it will help to build back the trust. And the challenges for developing countries also can be, and LDCs, of course, can be considered as global challenges, sometimes such as we talked about, that like infrastructure, hard, soft, and legal as well. And then also that despite African countries individually, sometimes they cannot play a power politics, they cannot play, they don't have enough political muscle as a group. Then they represent an equal voice, and they can represent this equal voice, and they can have a strong weight in the negotiating multilateral arena. And last but not least, that RTAs in Africa, including and starting with the AFCFTA, can learn from the WTO experience and can become a building block for this multilateralism. Without a doubt, S&D has been one of the most contentious issues and will continue to be. Education, it plays a critical role for everyone at a national level, at an international level, and with new generations. So congratulations to all the participants that were here. And that are still willing to learn from this WTO and multilateral perspective. Thank you very much for being here. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. What an honor.
Let's stay in touch, people.
I'll do this group. Don't worry. I'll do it. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And congratulations to the winners. Bye-bye.
Fantastic. I will extend from Amazon, from the organizing committee of the John Jackson, the thanks that Professor Ramirez-Robles just made for the speakers. Many thanks for you. It was really an interesting webinar on our side also, and many thanks for your time and for those brilliant observation, comment, and speeches. So again, wonderful friend, and thanks a lot for you. For this, we will now switch to the concluding ceremony, the closing ceremony of the African regional branch of the John Jackson. We had a unusual situation, and we can say yesterday with a really let's say, so some logistical and technical point that made us having this award ceremony today at the end of this academic program. And we will see also that even in the awards, the situation is surprising also, and I'm really happy to announce this today. I think that first of all, I would like to thank all the participants and all the panelists that took part in the round for their commitment, for the time that they put in the competition. It's a lot of energy, and we showed that even if the competition is happening online, we still have an engagement which is really strong. So it's a great pleasure on the side of the organizing committee to see that. I will not extend too much. Thanks a lot also for the people that helped me on the side of the organizing committee. Many thanks to Professor Ramirez-Robles also for this academic program. I think I cannot stress this out enough. Many thanks to the team of timekeepers also that helped us and on the organizing committee. So many thanks to everyone. I think that it's words that we don't repeat enough. So I would like to put the emphasis on this. For this closing, let's say this closing ceremony of the round, we will divide it in two parts. First, we will announce the awards, so the winner of the different categories of the regional round, and then I will leave the floor to Ms. Svetlana Shubanova that will present you some opportunity from on the WTO side for the participants, because it's also one of the reasons of this competition for you to be able to see what opportunity you can have in this field and also with the WTO itself. So I think without any additional words, we can start the announcement of the award. I will invite the teams and the person that have been awarded to join us on the stage. So in order after this to take a short picture for promotional purposes. It's always a bit the goal, as we can imagine. And there is, as you know, 3 categories of awards. The first one are the best written submissions for the teams that scored the higher amount of points in the scoring of the written submission that they submitted in January. The second part are the best orators, the individuals that displayed a significant amount of skills when it comes to presentation, but also legal skills. And the last one, and not the least clearly, is the winners of the regional round, the team that won the totality of the round. So on this matter, I will start, of course, with the best written submission. Usually there is three prizes: the best award for the best complainant written submission, the best respondent written submission, and the best overall written submission. But this time, only one team won the totality of those prizes. And it's my great pleasure to award this to the team number 73. Congratulations, massive congratulations, especially for winning those 3 prizes all in one. So it's fantastic to see this. Many congratulations. I know that we are online, but still I would make this round of applause virtually, because I think that it's more than deserved. And if you can join, if you can activate your camera and your microphone, feel free to join us on the stage. On the side of the best orator, we also have a really, let's say, particular situation, because usually we have a prize for the best orator of the preliminaries, which are the two first day of the round. And then we have a best orator prize for the semifinals of the competition. And then we have a prize for the final session. However, once again, one person won the 3 best orator prizes, which is the first time, I must admit, that I see this. So I would like to say how much I'm impressed by this. And we had a great pleasure to hear this person during the totality of the days. And it's my great pleasure to say that those 3 awards have been granted to Mr. Mucina John Ngete from the team 16. So congratulations to him. It's more than impressive, and it was a great pleasure on our side to hear from him. So congratulations, hello. It's quite an achievement indeed.
Thank you so much.
Perfect, wonderful, and once again, I cannot stress out how much it's. We were really impressed when we saw that on the side of the organizing committee. It's the first time this year, and we are actually it's actually the 4th regional rounds organized. It's the first time that one person won the three restorative prizes. So I'm really stressing out how much it's quite impressive. So congratulations and fantastic. The last point, and it's also quite an important one, the winning team of this African regional round of the Johnny Jackson Moot competition. I don't like taking so much time to tease, let's say, but it's kind of always the same. We are speaking, but let's cut it. I think it's unfair for the teams. I would like to congratulate Team 72 that won this final of the African regional round. It's really impressive. As you know, it has been a lot of discussion, a lot of deliberation on the side of the panelists, due also to technicalities, but it was a lot of discussion. It's also quite an unprecedented situation. So I would like to congratulate you on this matter, and I will invite the awarded teams and person to join us on the stage, if you can, of course, to activate your camera for us to take a short screenshot, if it's good for you, of course. And then we'll leave the floor to Miss Shobanova, if it's good for you. Fantastic. Hello. I can see representative.
Hello, good evening. Yeah, this is the team lead for team 73.
Fantastic. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Perfect. Congratulations once again to all of you. Do you have any other team members that would like to join, or we can proceed with taking some pictures? Oh, I can see some people joining indeed. And congratulations once again. Fantastic. I think that we are one representative of the team 72 just disappeared for a few seconds. We will wait a bit for her to rejoin if it's possible, and then we'll proceed with some. I did totally forget to ask this, but do I have the consent of everyone present in this part of the room for the screenshots and for us to publish it on the LinkedIn page of the Johnny Jackson Moot competition? Fantastic. Perfect.
Yes, we do.
Great to hear. Are we having we are missing, I think, one representative of the team 72.
Ah, there he is.
Oh, I can see. I think that everyone is here. And then I will count from 3, 2, 1, and 0. Perfect. As always, I took plenty. We never know with this online format. So I will be certain that that at least 1 or 2 will be perfect for everyone. Thanks a lot for the time and the energy that you put in the competition, for the commitment. Thanks a lot for your patience. The situation of yesterday was quite unexpected, but still, on this matter, I would like to thank also the panelists for the commitment and for the time they put it in the deliberation and in having those calls and putting a lot of energy in this. So thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for everyone. I will now would like to leave the floor to Miss Shobanova, if she's present in the chat. Yes, fantastic. I can see you. Can you hear us and see us perfectly well? I don't know if it's only me, but I cannot hear you perfectly. No. or maybe it's only me, and then I would. We cannot hear you at the moment. I can send you the links for you to connect on your phone, maybe.
Can you hear me now? I'm trying
perfectly well.
Oh, now you can hear me.
Yeah,
all right,
exactly.
Good. I suppose I just had to change the microphone. All right, well, thank you very much, Louis, for giving me the floor. And I want to extend, first of all, my congratulations to all the participants in this competition. And as part of the panel that was deliberating yesterday for so long, I would like to apologize on my behalf and on behalf of my colleagues. We took our job very seriously, hence, since both teams were very good and the margin was very narrow, we did not want to take our job lightly, and we wanted to deliberate until we were sure which one should emerge as a winner. We did have some technical difficulties, so we had to reconvene later that day. And I can assure you, yesterday at 10 o'clock Geneva time, we were still deliberating and trying to decide who to award the best team award to. So I just want to congratulate both finalists and tell you that you have both won, and you have both won our respect and really admiration for your performance. You did really great. So without further ado, Louis had asked me to say a couple of words as somebody that has been involved in the organization of the African Round for the last few years. And I was wondering what to talk to you about so that it also has some value to you and for your future development. So I decided that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the African Round so that you know whose footsteps you're walking into this year. And also I'm going to talk to you about some opportunities for internships and other ways to gain experience at the WTO. To begin with, I just wanted to say a couple of words about my own mooting experience, because mooting has been extremely important for me as well, and I think it brought me where I am. And I should have probably said that I work at the WTO, and I have been part of the Appellate Body Secretariat for 5 years, I think, before now being seconded to the Market Access Division. As you know, right now the Appellate Body Secretariat is not functioning temporarily, hopefully. Yes, so I came from very different background as you did. I am from Bulgaria, so when I was doing my law studies, Bulgaria was acceding to the European Union, and I found European law very interesting. I thought, well, what about all these moot courts? Maybe I should gain some experience. And at the time, we did not, and I think that's my experience with a lot of African universities, at least in the past. We did not have the textbooks, we did not have the coaches, we did not have any experience. So basically we were just enthusiastic couple of colleagues, friends, who decided to participate in one moot court competition. Without much experience, perhaps we didn't do great, but I think it really opened our eyes for the world of European Union law. And then I participated in another one, further decided to pursue my master's studies in European Union law. So from one step to another, that is what brought me presently to the WTO. Funny fact, I actually saw my husband for the first time at one of those moot courts, so you never know what might be the side benefits. I think at the time we were both way too busy mooting, so we didn't pay too much attention to each other, but who knows whether we would have met at the same law firm in Brussels years later if it was not for that mooting experience. So that's about mooting, and I just really wanted to tell you that no matter whether you're going to be doing national law, international law, and whatever field of law actually you're going to continue your careers with, these advocacy skills, these reasoning skills that you're developing here are extremely important, and they're gonna make a difference in your career. So no matter whether you're amongst the winners or not amongst the winners today, be sure that you're doing an important step by taking so much time and investment in this competition, and nothing is really lost. Right, so moving on to the African regional round, there are a lot of people that have contributed hugely to the establishment of this round and to its development over the years. So the first regional round was it was started back in 2014 with only 7 teams participating, but only a couple of years later, in 2018 and 2019, we already had 20 teams around Africa participating in this round. And as most of you know, probably in 2019, it was for the first time that the University of Strathmore Law School, Kenya, actually won against Harvard and became the first African university that won the John Jackson Moot Court competition. So I think this, over the years, it has been my experience that this round has proven really as a powerful catalyst for young people's careers development. And some of them have gone on to do masters in international trade law in IELPO, at the WTI, at the Graduate Institute. Others have then pursued internships at the WTO in other international organizations, or have continued their careers in the private sector in law firms. So that just gives you the idea of how this competition opened doors for you. There are really a lot of people that have helped the development of this competition, but I just wanted to mention those people that I have personally worked closely with. And one of them is my colleague from the Appellate Body Secretariat, Chibole Wakole. She was at the origin of creating the African round, and it really required, at least in the beginning, a lot of not only financial, but also institutional and technical support. Another person who I would like to mention and who you just had the chance to hear during the academic event is my colleague from the ACWO, Kolofelo Kugler. And she has also spent a lot of time and investment, her time and support to develop the African round. Several years ago, she was the one who actually created the so-called coaches project that we have now extended to also other developing countries around the world, actually. But basically, every year before the ELSA case is out, Kolofelo and her colleagues from ACWL would give the opportunities for young coaches from Africa to have one-on-one sessions and develop a little bit more knowledge on basic principles of WTO law, but also on strategy during the written, during the oral part of the John Jackson Moot, also understand more about the sources of where students can use for researching, etc. So it has really been very important in this capacity building exercise and expanding the ability not only of students, but also their coaches to support them in this process, which, as you know, is quite difficult and time consuming for everyone, but also very rewarding, I hope. So what I would like to tell you in this respect is that we are probably looking again for next year for another university to volunteer and host the African round. So think about whether you might want to be the ones to do that. It is not a small investment either, but I think it's also a very rewarding experience, and there's a lot of knowledge and experience that comes with it. So think about how you might want to be involved in this competition further, maybe coach a team next year, maybe tell your fellow colleagues that might want to participate. So raise awareness, and I hope this experience has been positive for you, and it's also, you have also understood the benefits for yourself. So thirdly, I would like to talk to you a little bit about the WTO and opportunities for working at the WTO. So as you know, we do dispute settlement. We do also many other things. There is the administration and the implementation of the various WTO agreements. It's also forum for negotiations. I think a lot of this was mentioned also in the context of the academic events that you just followed. We settle disputes. We also have the so-called trade policy review mechanism for review of trade policies of members. We provide technical assistance and capacity building. So all this we do. And this is to say, if you would like to pursue perhaps a career or you're interested in WTO law, that's not only the dispute settlement in it. Specifically about dispute settlement, there are two divisions, three normally, currently two that are dealing with dispute settlement. So this is the legal affairs division, which is providing assistance to panels on most of the WTO agreements. And then there is the separate rules division, which again, teams like us assist panels on three specific agreements, which are a bit more technical and require more, let's say, economic analysis. These are the anti-dumping, the subsidies, and the safeguards agreements. Of course, even though these two divisions are separate, there is a lot of interactions in terms of work, in terms of staff between them as well. And then there is the appellate body secretariat, which is currently perhaps not hiring, but we all hope that in the future it will renew its work. And all the other divisions, so you might be interested in negotiations, or you might be interested more in the more technical work of the WTO. There are also opportunities for lawyers. So what I mean to say is there's much beyond dispute settlement. So what are the ways into the WTO if that's something you're interested in? There, first of all, the internships. So importantly, they're open to postgraduate students. So normally you should have finished your master's in order to be eligible. You should be from one of the nations that is either acceding to the WTO or already a WTO member. You should be between the years of 21 and 30 years old. And this is an internship that would normally last between 3 and 6 months. Importantly, there is a stipend that you receive per day. So you can say this is a paid internship because, as you know, life in Geneva is not really cheap. So I think that's a great thing that the WTO is doing, because the UN internships, as far as I know, they're still not paid. So importantly, do your master's and then consider that. We'll be happy to receive your CVs. And there is an e-recruitment website where you would find the way where you can fill in your resume and send it to the system. So then we also provide, for those of you with more academic inclinations, we provide PhD support. So that would give you access to WTO facilities and information, opportunities for interactions with different professionals at the WTO. And this is something that is not going to engage you directly in WTO work, because you're supposed to advance with your own academic research, but will definitely immerse you in the atmosphere of the WTO work, let's say. And finally, and something that you might be looking into more along after you begin your professional careers, is the so-called Young Professionals Program. So there we are looking for young professionals who already have at least 2 years of experience, and they have a strong interest, demonstrated interest in international trade and commitment related to WTO work. Specifically, preference is given to WTO or to members, or let's say to candidates from countries, WTO members who are underrepresented or non-represented in the Secretariat currently, in the WTO Secretariat. So if you were to apply for this opportunity, I think as well, there is an information on the WTO website. You'll be given more information whether your country might be in the list of one of those countries that are underrepresented at the Secretariat. So then this is an opportunity more along the lines of a real professional with more responsibilities. It lasts one year and you're paid a salary, obviously, by the WTO. So these are 3 opportunities that are very interesting. And finally, I just wanted to say, I've spoken recently also to one of my colleagues from the Secretariat, and we've discussed this point. We wanted to share, to pass on the word to you, that you should not restrict yourself probably to very narrow studies, and you should think about other areas of international economic law beyond the WTO. WTO is obviously very fascinating and interesting field of international economic law to work in, but you might want to look also at other things. There is arbitration, there is the regional dimension. Previous speakers in the academic event mentioned the African continental free trade area. It has dispute settlement provisions, so that might be a great opportunity for you as well. There are many, many opportunities. There are other international organizations as well. But as exciting as WTO is, I suppose my message is open yourself for possibilities. Don't specialize narrowly because you're all very young, and I'm sure you have all bright and brilliant careers in front of you. And I just want to close with wishing that each of you finds their unique place, which would make you fulfilled and will pursue your career in the best possible way. And having finished, I don't presume that I have covered perhaps all the ground that's interesting for you. So I would invite you either in the chat or directly unmuting to pose any questions related to the WTO, to opportunities or anything else that you think I might be helpful with answering.
Thanks a lot, Svetlana, for this. For the question, if you have, you can directly open your microphone and your camera, or you can also ask it in the chat if you have any point that you would like to raise. I don't see any. Usually it's when I'm saying that a question is popping up, but if there is none, this is why I'm trying to talk a bit more so we don't miss anything. But if there is none, I would like to thank you a lot for this intervention. I'm certain that it was really beneficial for the participants, and also I cannot agree more with the message that you shared about how the experience per se is really beneficial for any students and for any future young professional. So many thanks for this. I think that now we can officially close this African regional round. If you have any question, if you have any point that you would like to ask, you can contact me at mootcourts@elsa.org, of course. And if not, I will finish this regional month by congratulating all the participants. Thank you for the commitment, thank you for the time, and thank you for the energy. I think that we can officially say that this round is closed. Thanks a lot for everything, and goodbye.